Do you have any habits that have become so routine or predictable that friends or family will tease you about them? One of mine is my lunchtime habit. I eat almost the same thing every day, and with slight alterations have done so for the last 15 years or more. On our family vacation in June, my wife mentioned something about my habit to my sister-in-law, who commented that it's not unique to me. It turns out it's the same for all of the men in my family. We're creatures of habit. It runs in our DNA. Several weeks ago, we looked at Paul's habit. In Acts 13:14, Luke tells us, from Perga, they went to Pisidian Antioch on the Sabbath. They entered the synagogue and sat down. Then in 14:1, we're told at Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. In Acts 17:2, it says, as was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures. Do you see the trend? I mean, it's hard to miss. On the Sabbath day, Paul went to the synagogue, which should tell us that something is amiss in Acts 16. When Luke says, on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. This wasn't Paul mixing it up. I mean, he wasn't trying something new. He didn't go to this synagogue because apparently in Philippi there wasn't a synagogue. At the time, Jewish custom required at least 10 men to establish a synagogue. That there were only women gathered at the place of prayer makes sense of this detail. The Jewish community was so small in Philippi, there weren't even 10 men. That it was outside the city gate speaks of the further marginalized status of Judaism in the eyes of the Philippians. Now, Judaism was marginalized, but that doesn't mean everyone came from the margins. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. Now, Lydia was a merchant, and to be a merchant who dealt in purple cloth meant the use of an expensive dye. That purple would represent royalty and priests. It meant that a dealer of this was particularly affluent. Now, she was from Thyatira, a city known for their trade in dyes, particularly purple. And it also happens to be one of the 7 churches mentioned in Revelation. Now, interestingly, she is not mentioned as a Jew, but a worshiper of God. It's the same word used of Cornelius back in Acts 10. And like Cornelius, upon placing her faith in Jesus, her whole house is baptized. I love the way that this passage depicts grace and agency, as well as the response, or the power of the gospel to bring a response, I should say. Now, first of all, Lydia placed herself in the right place. On the Sabbath, as a God worshiper, she was there for worship. Second, she was listening and paying attention. She didn't mock or dismiss Paul. She listened. She was in the right place, doing the right thing with the right attitude. But she didn't save herself. In God's grace, we're told the Lord opened her heart to respond. This should give us some comfort as we share the good news with our friends and our family. That it isn't about our powers of persuasiveness, but it is the Lord who opens hearts and leads people to respond to the message. It should also humble us as we think through our own response to the gospel. We might have put ourselves in the right place. We might have had the right attitude. We didn't open our own hearts to the message of God. We have no room for boasting. And Lydia doesn't just pray a prayer or check her connection card. When the Lord opened her heart, she and the members of her household were baptized. Then she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. Now remember, Lydia was a woman with power, possession, and prestige. And when she surrendered her life to Jesus, it meant she surrendered those things to Jesus as well. In her opening her heart to God, it went hand in hand with opening her home to God's people. I pray that this passage would comfort us and encourage us as we share the good news and to challenge us as we respond to what God's done in Jesus. Have a blessed week.